Welcome to this explainer on ISO 14001-2026. Today we're unpacking something pretty massive: how true environmental management goes way beyond just keeping a dusty compliance binder sitting on a shelf. We're looking at how it absolutely has to transform into a living, breathing, enterprise-wide system of accountability. So let's dive right in. Because the standard makes it crystal clear, environmental management isn't just a side chore anymore. It's fundamentally about how your entire organization operates.
So, let me ask you, who actually owns your environmental performance? Sounds like a super simple question, right? But honestly, it is usually the hardest one for companies to answer. You know, tons of organizations proudly display this nice little environmental policy on their website or framed in the lobby. But that whole illusion of compliance completely shatters the second we ask who actually owns the outcomes when things go wrong. If a chemical spill happens or emissions suddenly spike, whose performance review actually takes the hit? Because if everyone is responsible, usually that means no one is.
All right, here's our game plan for today. We're going to breeze through the illusion of compliance, nail down true system boundaries, look at integrating that management into daily operations, transform accountability with a racy structure, close what's called the authority gap, and finally, figure out how to actually sustain this performance long-term.
So kicking things off with Section 1, the illusion of compliance, and why we absolutely have to move beyond isolated tasks.
You see, true compliance requires an integrated system. It's not just a checklist of administrative chores. Back in the day, companies used to just dump all this on one poor environmental coordinator down the hall and call it a day. But treating environmental management as a separate, siloed task inevitably leads to a complete mess. Fragmented practices, total confusion over who does what, and ultimately, some seriously costly audit failures. You simply cannot manage environmental risks if the folks making the daily operational decisions aren't totally looped into the system.
Which brings us right to Section 2. Defining true environmental management system, or EMS, boundaries. Before we even think about handing out roles, we have to draw the lines. What specific activities, products, and physical places are actually included in our system? Under Clause 4.3, defining the EMS scope is the absolute foundation. It makes sure that every significant environmental risk and legal obligation falls squarely within your control. And we're not just talking about drawing a circle around a factory on a map. This includes physical boundaries like warehouses, operational boundaries like outsourced logistics, and even functional boundaries like strategic planning. Your scope has to reflect the actual reality of your operations.
But here's the catch. You've got to watch out for what auditors call artificial scope limitations. This is basically when a company strategically tries to hide their high-emission operations behind third-party contractors, or they casually leave out a hazardous waste storage facility just to make their audit a bit easier. The standard is strict on this. You must consider the degree of control or influence you actually have. So, if you contract out your logistics, but you're the one dictating the routes and the fuel requirements, that operation clearly influences your footprint, and there is no way you can artificially bypass it.
Moving right along to Section 3. Integrating environmental management directly into operations.
Okay, so once we've honestly and comprehensively set those boundaries, Clause 4.4 tells us it's time to bust environmental management out of that sustainability silo. It has to live inside your core business operations. We're talking about embedding environmental risk evaluation right into operational work instructions, supply chain governance, and your long-term corporate strategy. Let's say your company sets an objective to slash energy consumption. That target literally has to be baked into the engineering team's equipment procurement specs and the facility manager's daily routines. It can't just be tracked on a spreadsheet by one isolated officer.
Now for Section 4, transforming accountability with a ROSI framework.
This is where things get really cool, and it requires a massive shift in how we structure our teams. Think about your traditional corporate organizational chart. Usually, environmental duties are totally sidelined, right? Maybe tucked under legal or a standalone health and safety branch. But ISO 14001 mandates a complete governance shift. Clause 5.3 says these responsibilities have to be formally distributed across all operational departments. We're talking about literally watching that old-school corporate organizational chart morph into an interactive, racy matrix, explicitly highlighting defined environmental responsibilities, authorities, and accountability assigned to various departmental managers.
It is A total game changer. Instead of vague job titles, we get explicit roles assigned using that Rossi framework: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Procurement now completely owns supplier selection. Operations is strictly handling emissions control. Maintenance is the one accountable for hazardous waste disposal. This cross-functional accountability is exactly what the standard demands. It ensures the environment is quite literally everyone's business, perfectly tailored to how they actually influence daily operations.
All right, Section 5, closing the authority gap to actually empower these roles.
Because here is the brutal truth. Slapping an R or an A next to someone's name on a matrix is only half the battle. If that person doesn't have the real power to execute the task, the assignment is totally useless. This creates what's known as the authority gap. You see, responsibility just means you're tasked with doing the work, like monitoring for compliance. Authority, on the other hand, means you actually possess the decision-making power, the budget, and the influence to enforce it. If you're responsible for preventing leaks but you have zero authority to actually schedule downtime for preventative maintenance, yeah, the whole system fails.
And you wouldn't believe how often this trips companies up during audits under Clause 5.3. A whopping 40% of audit failures come down to a lack of delegation records. That is a classic authority gap right there. Basically, it happens when a site manager is held accountable for environmental compliance, but top management never actually gave them the formal, documented authority to shut down a non-compliant production line or authorize the budget for a new filter. The standard strictly requires that authority structures genuinely back up those assigned responsibilities.
Finally, Section 6, sustaining environmental performance and driving continuous improvement. So how do we keep this whole system alive and kicking? Well, top management absolutely has to lead the charge here. If a plant manager's end-of-year bonus is based 100% on production volume and 0% on waste reduction targets, then your EMS is completely symbolic. Sustaining performance means tying executive evaluations directly to environmental metrics. On top of that, your escalation pathways have to be crystal clear. People need to know exactly how to report risks without running into a maze of procedural barriers. And management has to continuously review these structures to make sure they still make sense for the business.
There's this fantastic quote derived from the Auditor training modules that perfectly hits the nail on the head. Environmental management must encompass all activities capable of influencing environmental outcomes, not merely symbolic compliance. Honestly, that is the entire ethos of ISO 1401-2026 right there. A real EMS is a living, breathing system of accountability, backed by real governance, clear boundaries, and distributed authority. It is definitely not just a shiny certificate you frame and hang on the wall.
So I want to leave you with this to chew on as you look at your own organization. Take a hard look at your org chart. Is your environmental responsibility actually supported by real, tangible authority, or is it really just a fancy title on a piece of paper? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, everyone. I hope it gave you a crystal clear look at the mechanics of true environmental accountability. Catch you next time.